Bonsoir et bienvenue. Merci d'être avec nous cet après-midi ou ce soir ou ce matin pour cette première rencontre webinaire de la délégation du Québec à Rome, ici en Italie. Buon pomeriggio, buongiorno e ben ritrovati. Sono molto felice di darvi il benvenuto a questo nostro primo incontro virtuale. Vi ringrazio di cuore per la vostra partecipazione. E anche se non mi è possibile vedervi, so che siete in molti ad aver accettato il nostro invito e per questo vi ringrazio. So I'll say it this time in English. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you may be in the world joining us. Thank you for being there with us. For our very first webinar, it is an online discussion today that brings together Quebec and Italy during a period where we've been for too long far apart. I would like to thank our panelists today. We're delighted that you have accepted to join this roundtable discussion to look at the world of import-export and more precisely at the world of international logistics, which is, as you know, a very essential and also very complex component of global economy. And we've brought together professionals of the industry in hope that they can share with us their insights, their perspectives, and their experience during this most exceptional period. I will introduce them shortly, but before I do, I would like to take a moment to tell you about the Quebec office in Italy and its role and relevance in this very important G7 economy. Now, you may not know this, but Quebec has been active on the international scene since the days of Confederation. Our government began setting up offices in the early 40s in the US of A, and it crossed the pond over here to Europe in 1961. It established its first office in Paris in 61, then came London in 1962, and then in 1965, Quebec opened its office in Milan, Italy. Indeed, this year, we're celebrating our 55th anniversary. Now, we were hoping to have celebrations, but there have been postponed, as you can imagine. Now, interestingly enough, the Milan Bureau was set up with an economic, business, and investment mandate. Quebec realized back then the potential offered by the booming economy in Italy. It saw the possibilities for cooperation and collaboration for our businesses in this European industrial country, which was rapidly, very rapidly rebuilding its economy and its infrastructures after World War II. And the mandate of the Quebec office in Italy has expanded considerably since the 60s. In addition to business promotion, we also promote Quebec's interests in the arts, in culture, in immigration, education, and in all those areas that are deemed strategic and that are priorities to our societies, like la francophonie, for example, or issues relating to climate change, to gender equality, to LGBTQ rights. Quebec wanted then and wants today to develop and reinforce this relationship with Italy and to facilitate and promote partnerships between companies, between investors, universities, research centers, scientists, in order for our economies to continue to prosper and to grow together. Now, with that mission statement, the Quebec office in Italy offers support and services to both Quebec and Italian companies and individuals seeking to expand internationally. We have a very dynamic economic and innovation and technology team that crosses Italy from north to south, seeking opportunities, identifying possible investors, and advising entrepreneurs. And it is precisely with the entrepreneurs in mind that during the darkest days of the pandemic lockdown here in Italy, our team reached out to our partners and realized that we needed to do more, to do even more for them in this very tricky phase. That is the post-lockdown period when government around the world, all the governments around the world are easing restrictions, but where the economy is suffering from months of lockdown. That is why we cannot thank our panelists enough for accepting to speak to us today and to delve into the world of international logistics, to share their experience during the COVID-19 lockdown, to give us their insight on the impact the lockdown had on international trade, the impact it had on their operations and on their businesses specifically. We also hope they can share the lessons learned as well as the solutions they envisage going forward in order to provide this essential service to businesses on both sides of the Atlantic. So we welcome to the panel our guests today, and let me introduce them. We have with us Ms. Patricia Occhiuto. She is co-president of Les Importations Mini Italia based in Montreal. Ms. Occhiuto is a tax and mergers and acquisitions specialist as well as an entrepreneur. She's been at the head of Les Importations Mini Italia for over 2 decades. The company imports and distributes specialty Italian food products from Italy across Canada. Now, Ms. Occhiuto is a member of the executive board of the Montreal Italian Chamber of Commerce. She's also a member of the board of Investissement Québec internationale. Welcome. We're also happy to have with us Mr. Giulio Schenone. Mr. Schenone is a principal of the Gruppo Investimenti Portuali SPA, one of the most important terminal operators in Italy. He founded the corporation close to 30 years ago, and he has since joined forces with major European investors in the infrastructure sectors, strategically positioning his group to reach the main markets in Southern Europe and Northern and Central Italy. As well, Mr. Schenone is chairman of Medov SRL, which is based in Genoa, and he is CEO of IL Investimenti with interests in shipping, in logistics and tourism services, and he sits on numerous industry boards and associations, including the executive board of the Genoa Chamber of Commerce. Welcome, Mr. Schenone. And we're delighted to have with us Mr. Tony Boemi. He is Vice President, Growth and Development for the Montreal Port Authority. Mr. Boemi is a maritime industry specialist, having led for years IT, marketing and sales, and commercial trade services for CP Ships, once Canada's largest shipping company. Since joining the Montreal Port Authority in 2008, Tony Boemi is responsible for commercial strategies in the sectors of containers, general cargo, liquid and dry bulk commodities, and as well as the cruise sector. He also sits on the executive committees of several maritime industry associations. Welcome, Mr. Boemi. Welcome, Tony. Now, the Port of Montreal is a fully diversified world-class port. It is the largest port on the eastern coast of Canada. It is connected to more than 140 countries around the world. Now, here in Italy, we have always promoted the Port of Montreal as the gateway to the North American market and as the ideal logistics hub for international trade between Europe and North America. We tell exporters here that the Port of Montreal brings you not only into Canada, but right into the heart of North America. So welcome one and all. We will begin this discussion with a series of questions that I will put to each one of you. I invite our participants to send along your questions via the chat box here on the platform. You will find it at the bottom of your screen. So before we begin, Tony, I'd like to address one specific question to you so you can set the table for us, okay? Can you tell us what Italy represents for the Port of Montreal in terms of business, in terms of market, in terms of development?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and it's a really pleasure for me to be here and to be able to speak to you about the Port of Montreal. Certainly, the Port of Montreal has had a long history with Italian ports. I mean, when you consider the services, the direct services that are coming in from Italy into Montreal, we have several Mediterranean services. We call several ports in Italy, to name a few, Genoa, Livorno, Naples, Salerno, and so on and so forth. It's actually one of the 40% of our business with Quebec and Italy trades through the Port of Montreal. We average almost, I would say, 140 to 150,000 TEUs for the past 5 years. And of course, when you look at, for example, the type of commodities that are traded through the Port of Montreal, between Canada and Italy, specifically Quebec, of course, we speak of the wines with the SAQ, there's food products, auto parts, clothing. And on the export side, it's a little bit the same thing. We export a lot of agricultural products, so on and so forth. All that to say that it's always been an important cog in the whole Port of Montreal the services that we offer. And so from that perspective, you know, it's also evidenced by the fact that 40% of our container trade between the Port of Montreal is with Italy for Quebec. And this is really evidenced by the fact that we have representation in Italy through the services of Medov, one of our speakers here, who actually represents the Port of Montreal, not only in Italy, but in all over Europe. So that in a nutshell is really a very quick overview of what the Port of Montreal means and the Italian market means to us.
Thank you. Now tell us, Tony, how did the COVID-19 crisis impact the operations at the port? Now, what did it mean for your customers and how did you manage to keep things moving?
Another very good question. Well, certainly like everywhere else throughout the world, the COVID-19 was a major issue. Basically, a lot of the measures that we took enabled us to maintain a fluidity within the port. Of course, once Transport Canada put out the regulations, in conjunction with the regulations that were put out by the Quebec government, and we worked together to put the proper measures within the ports to make sure that the cargo would maintain a fluidity. So we actually worked with the Maritime Employers Association. The Maritime Employers Association is actually the association that works with the labor down at the ports. We had good collaboration from them. We had good collaboration from the Quebec government, especially in terms of what was considered as cargoes that were essential. So one of the concerns that we had is once they started to shut down, as we saw everywhere else throughout the world, it was important for cargoes that were considered essential or critical continue to move. And so initially when they came out with the instructions, which was only critical cargoes could move from the Port of Montreal over to the importers and exporters. But in actual fact, if we only move the critical cargoes, all the cargoes that would remain at the port would probably lead to some form of congestion. So through discussions with the Quebec government, they realized the impact that this may have and basically allowed the cargoes to move outside the port. So we've always maintained a very fluid operation. All the measures that were taken were done so with everybody collaborating together. And the example I want to give is I remember when we had the first reported case of COVID-19 at the port was closed for 16 hours. Obviously, you can't have fluidity, you can't have urgency, or you can't ensure that essential cargoes are moved if you shut down the port. Once all the measures were really understood by everybody and we got into a normal pattern, I can say that since then, there's been absolutely no delays at the port resulting from issues of COVID-19. Whenever there's been certain individuals that were diagnosed, it was very transparent. All the measures that are in place enabled us to continue with this fluidity. So in actual fact, there's been no downtime at the port, and we've been able to maintain that essential cargoes, pharmaceuticals, medical equipment, so on and so forth, continue to move within the city and everywhere else. So
that's remarkable. Thank you. Thank you, Tony. Mr. Schenone, what was the situation for the ports here in Italy?
Good afternoon to all, and thank you again for the invitation. Fortunately, we were in a lockdown state since the early part of March, the beginning of March in Italy, as we all know. But we were able somehow to cope with a bit of luck and with a bit of preventive measures, fortunately. So we were eventually in a situation very similar to the Port of Montreal. In those ports, in the ports that we manage, 2 container terminals in Genoa, 1 in Livorno and 1 in Venice, we had no loss of working hours or shifts. We implemented right away a number of preventive and precautionary measures, not only to our direct employees, but also to the dockers companies and all our subcontractors, whether they were dockers, truckers, service companies providing maintenance and repair to cranes, and we were also quite stringent in sanitizing all the equipment. For example, at the end of every working shift, which was quite a costly measure, but it allowed us, fortunately, to keep everybody healthy and safe. And I have to say that finally, we can say that after 3 months of lockdown, we were able to achieve both main objectives which we had set ourselves: to keep everybody healthy and safe, first of all, and to keep the cargo flow ongoing. Italy was in a state of severe lockdown for 2 months, as you know, and the logistic activities, whether they were ports, inland transportation, warehousing, distribution, were considered an essential service and therefore could not be stopped by government decree. So we were somehow forced to continue, We did so with some extra efforts and extra care and extra costs, but we were able to achieve those objectives, fortunately.
Thank you. So I'm turning now to Patricia Occhiuto, because you are the client in this scenario. You're the importer. How did your company deal with the lockdown? Were your operations affected? Were you able to import products from Italy?
Yes. Hi, Marianna. Thank you for inviting me to participate on this interesting webinar. Yes, as an importer, obviously there were many implications to my business as a whole. I mean, just the way I had to run the business here in Canada was very widely affected. But there was also the effect from the trade, the import aspect, and that I mean, I was able to import products from Italy, so that there was no interruption in terms of imports coming in from Italy. Where we encountered difficulties were obviously on the Italian side, having had the impact of COVID a few weeks prior to Canada. They were already in lockdown by the time everything started happening here in Canada. And so from a producer perspective, they had to work on reduced staff. They had some staff that was on sick leave. Some staff had to take care of children. So they were operating on reduced staff. Basically, my lead time was increased. They also had difficulty obtaining raw materials for production. And so the Italian producers faced a lot of their own challenges. From a transport perspective, I think, Tony addressed that a little bit earlier, but the whole transit of the empty containers, so often containers coming in from Italy would have to wait to receive empty containers from China. And of course, we all know that, that whole, the implications of all of that. So at the Italian, from a producer perspective, they were waiting on empty containers to become available, which delayed shipments from that perspective. There were a little bit of delays, again, as Tony mentioned, that the 68 hours, there were occasional delays here once the merchandise arrived. So all in all, yes, there were implications from various different aspects of the business that I had to manage and basically on a dime figure out how to deal with.
Thank you, Patricia. So I come back to Mr. Schenone, because what Patricia just mentioned just opens up a whole new realm of, are you going to see the repercussions now because of the slowdown? And I'm imagining, everyone was busy, operations were fluid, but as Patricia mentioned, companies were not able to produce on time, and we've got this, on-time delivery. So are you seeing the repercussions now in the various ports that you work in, Mr. Schenone?
Yes, we are. If we look at the volumes, the first quarter was basically in line with what our budget expectations were. Then, China started having the first impact. China, North Asia and Southeast Asia followed. Then, Europe went into a state of lockdown in March, April, and therefore, importers and exporters were forced to reduce or close down their whole activity. And then, unfortunately, the virus spread over, across the Atlantic and, to North America as well as, Central and South America. And the second quarter, which is closing tomorrow, as a matter of fact, is indeed showing, the worst numbers. I mean, we have a drop in overall volumes on average by 20% over, April, May, and June compared to budget and compared to expectations. Clearly, the global trade is very much led by internal consumption and consumer spending in Italy for the last 3 months was down to the bare minimum. Essentials, foodstuff, medicines, and little else. E-commerce had a little bit of a surge, and in fact, I think also thanks to my wife's efforts, we have become Amazon's top customer in the last few weeks, but in Italy, or certainly in Genoa. But apart from that, I think it is the impact is really is really being felt now.
Thank you. And I put the same question to Tony Boemi, because yes, operations were there, you kept things moving, but as Mr. Schenone mentions, I mean, we're in the second quarter. What's it like for the Port of Montreal? What are your expectations?
Yeah, well, just to pick up on what Mr. Schenone said, if you follow the pattern, as he mentioned in terms of starting off in Asia, what you saw was as they shut down in Asia, that affected all volumes going on the West Coast. So we saw, for example, on the West Coast ports, a reduction in volumes in the months of January, February. And then as Europe shut down and followed by North America, if you continue to follow the wave, that's where all of a sudden the impact has now reached us. And so, for example, if you look at our first quarter results, we actually had excellent results. We actually surpassed all expectations. And I would say even let's say part of April, once May kicked in, and again, which is really when, when you look at the closure in Europe and how it affected and the timeline, well, we had a horrible May. I mean, we were down almost 14%. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the level of activity at the port, what we saw was that April was going well. And then all of a sudden, we saw the level of activity towards the months of May come down. We get the results in May, which was minus 14% on the container business. And then as we're following May, June, we see that the uptick is only starting now. So we don't have our June figures yet. We would expect, for example, June to be very close to what we experienced in May. And really what we're hoping for is that this does continue to go upward. Again, measuring the level of activity that we do on a daily basis, we see that it's much more active now than it was even 2 or 3 weeks ago. And so from that perspective, we'll hopefully, this wave will just carry on and keep going.
Sounds encouraging.
Yeah.
Sounds encouraging. Thank you. So I come back to Patricia. So you were forced to manage this major slowdown. So what changes do you have to implement in your company to be able to face this? And how are you going to adapt? And how do you see, import-export going forward with Italy in your business?
Well, in terms of how I had to adapt, so if I'm going to start with that, I think one of the first greatest and most obvious obstacles I had to sort of find a way around was figuring out, there was a shift in demand, and I work in the food industry. And so for me, there was a big shift from big increase in sales of non-perishable items. So obviously, as we all know, a lot of flour, a lot of pasta, a lot of canned goods, were the sales of those items went through the roof, whereas sales of perishable items was decreasing. And so there was a huge shift in demand of a change in demand of my products. And we were all caught off guard with this whole virus thing. And so this wasn't something we could have predicted. With a lead time of 30 to 45 days importing products from Italy, it's hard to adapt, instantaneously to the new demand. My suppliers were also equally caught off guard in having difficulty to supply the new items that I needed to sell. And so that was the first impact. Then we also had, the lead time changed, as I mentioned. How do I see this going forward? In all honesty, I think I see things slowly returning back to normal. As Tony mentioned, as Giulio mentioned, we're starting to see a little bit of a shift more towards what we consider normal in our business, both in terms of volume, in terms of activity, in terms of demand. I'm going to side with Tony and say hopefully the wave continues and we see this just pass, and then things will return to something that's a little more familiar with what we've all been used to dealing with in the past.
Thank you. Mr. Schenone, you have a very, you're an expert in this field, and you're familiar with Europe, and for 30 years, you looked at infrastructure and ports and investments and all the rest of it. How do you see this going forward? are you going to have to change your business model? Do you see trades going to pick up? Is globalization going to be redefined, and therefore, you know, they talk about closer to home value chains? Does that mean less business? How do you see it from your end?
I've tried to look at my crystal ball several times, actually on a daily basis for the last 60 days. And I've heard, you know, a lot of interesting theories. I certainly feel that we will face, you know, a worldwide recession. Unfortunately, it's not a nice word to use, but I think we need to face reality rather than just, you know, stick our head under, you know, the sand. I mean, there will be a global recession because, you know, the GDP of most industrialized countries has shrunk and is shrinking by double digits, sorry, and therefore it's unavoidable in a way. So this will lead obviously to, you know, and we will need to be, you know, in a crisis mode and in a management of crisis mode for a while longer, I believe. Despite, you know, the positive numbers that we see in the infections, at least in, you know, Western Europe, unfortunately not yet so in North America, although I hope that will change soon. So in every crisis there are opportunities, and we also have to be you know, quick to grab those opportunities. As they say, you know, never waste a good crisis. And the lessons that we have learned are those of, I guess, digitalization and regionalization. I mean, many people think that, you know, the supply chain will be regionalized and will come closer to home, because they've realized that you know, having a global, you know, supply chain will indeed create issues, or could create issues, should something happen again in another part of the world which is not close to home. I mean, the classical example of, you know, the automotive industry, which is sourcing some essential parts of their, you know, work process in countries such as South Korea, which was one of the first countries to be affected, which were, when they closed down some of those factories, I mean, the whole automotive industry, whether it was in North America or in Europe, you know, started having issues. I don't think that, you know, the answer is only regionalization of supply chain. I personally believe that it's more diversifying the supply chain. I mean, clearly, you cannot only have one source country for all of your, I don't know, whatever commodity you're trading in, because if something happens to that country, whether it's politically or, you know, anything else, this may actually be a threat. So I think diversification is more the answer rather than, you know, regionalization. And the other aspect that we've learned is digitalization. I think we still have in the port industry, in the transportation industry, a lot of, you know, work processes which are not yet fully digitalized as they should be. Whether this is the container interchange, which is released from the empty depot to the trucker to go and pick up an export load. I'm sorry if I become too much, you know, into the detail, but this is just, you know, to give you a practical example. Or whether, you know, this is, you know, the electronic bill of lading, which is released by a shipping line to a shipper or a receiver. I think there's still far too much to do in this area. And I think we will have to push forward very quickly and without, you know, looking back over our shoulders on digitalization.
Thank you. And I'm glad you brought up diversification and digitalization, because it's part of our international vision for Quebec. We've set out 2 years ago almost now with our government, la diversification des marchés, where we want to tell our companies in Quebec to look farther than North America, to look across the world, to look at other markets. And that's the message that we take forward too, speaking to Quebec, reminding them that, you know, you're a vast market, and now, yes, understanding the times, but there are, G7 economies here that are very powerful that you can work with. And so I'm glad that, diversification came up in your thoughts, as well as digitalization, which is also one of our priorities as a government, which is very important. And on that note, I'd like to go over to Tony, because the Port of Montreal has been at the forefront of innovation in improving efficiencies of your services. I think of AI applications. I read recently, just before the lockdown, that you're moving really very quickly in that field. So tell us how the port is looking to the future and becoming more so innovative and addressing those issues that Mr. Schenone brought up, where your efficiencies and where clients from here and from Quebec and Canada can be assured that, they have an efficient infrastructure in Montreal.
Yes, thank you. And there's no doubt that we've really taken, I think, one of the leaders when it comes to all these new technologies that are being made available. Just to give you a bit of background on the Port of Montreal, we're one of 12 participants worldwide that belongs to the chain port community. This is a community that's by invitation only. In North America, the only two participants are the Port of Montreal and the Port of Los Angeles. And basically, the purpose of this community is to work on exactly that in terms of how we best share technologies that will address all issues, not just port issues, but in terms of environment and community and so on and so forth. So that's one of the things. We also belong to an organization called Centec, which is based in Montreal, which is an incubator. So we have a logistics incubator there. And what it is it gathers together all these startup companies. And what we do is we actually throw challenges at them in terms of whether it be in the case of fluidity, in terms of port operations, in terms of port infrastructure. And what they do is they actually develop tools that we can use to make our jobs a lot easier. We're also involved with TradeLens, which is a blockchain technology. So we're very heavily involved with that. And basically we're working with a lot of the carriers. We're working with Amazon. We have a couple of projects there. And in terms of artificial intelligence, we're also working with a company called Element AI. And as a matter of fact, I just take you back to one of the reasons why we were initially invited to join Chainport. So we have an application which is available right now and it's free. It's on Google or Apple. You can download it, just type in Port of Montreal. It's a truck portal. And what it does is, for example, it gives you real-time waiting time. And this might be beneficial for Patricia. The real-time waiting time of each individual terminals in terms of truck waiting times. But not only does it do that, it also gives you predictive analytics. So in other words, if I go onto that website right now, I'll be able to determine, for example, on Terminal A, if I should go there between 3 and 4 o'clock or between 4 and 5 o'clock. It actually gives you a predictive time, waiting time for each hour within the next 12 hours. Another thing that we're working on in terms of artificial intelligence is during this whole COVID-19, we were selected, or we were working on a project which was sponsored, where we received funding from the federal government to be able to identify cargoes that are considered critical or essential. So pharmaceuticals, medical supplies, so on and so forth. And basically what this allows us to do is when the vessel arrives, so we're able to determine what those cargoes are, how we can get at them, and how we can expedite them as fast as possible. And what I like about that is the big benefit where that's concerned is today we're focused on medical supplies and medical equipment and so on and so forth. But in the future, we can put that application into any cargoes that are considered essential or urgent. And interesting enough, we're also doing it on the cruise business. So in other words, we're working, and this is through the assistance of the provincial government, where we're actually developing a tool which again will give us some predictive analytics when it comes to passenger service. So if I can give you an example, a cruise ship comes in and you might have 100 or 1,200 passengers. And then what normally happens is you have, 400 taxis waiting outside, 16 buses. And so the whole idea behind that is as we're able to determine when the passengers come off, then we can determine when the taxis should come in. So that has a direct impact on greenhouse gases, reduction in greenhouse gases, and the environmental advantages of that state. So these are all projects that we're very, very heavily involved in. I would say the application on the urgent commodities or urgent cargoes will be an application within the next 3 to 4 weeks. The truck application has been in existence now for well over a year, but with the predictive analytics has been going on, I would say now for easily 3 to 4 months. So yeah, we've taken the lead. And of course, the whole idea behind that is fluidity, a reduction in downtime, reduction in greenhouse gases, better for the environment. Yeah.
Thank you. That sounds very, very exciting going forward. Perhaps we can organize a visit in Italy for you, Tony, and
I always
see
enjoy going to Italy.
No, but I mean, for the ports here, if they want to maybe partner up.
Yeah.
He's smiling. I understand the Port of Montreal very well, but
yeah,
a nice occasion to share some common knowledge, to share on this innovation going forward. Mr. Schenone, you mentioned digitalization a moment ago. Would this answer some of the needs that you have here as well?
Absolutely, yes. Unfortunately, we're not dealing in Italy with port authorities which are as proactive as the one to which Mr. Boemi belongs to, and which I have the pleasure of doing business with since a long time. But unfortunately, the situation in Italy is very regional. Of course, I mean we have 15 system port authorities across the country, and it is actually difficult to homogenize, procedures and processes, even if some of the laws and regulations are federal or are supposed to be federal. In this case, I mean, I can give you an example of the cruise industry. I mean, to which Mr. Boemi was referring to earlier on. I mean, we handle many cruise vessels in the capacity of agents and providers of transportation services, and we've handled many cruise vessels which were cutting their cruises short at the end of February or at the end of March, coming back to Italian ports to try and disembark their passengers and eventually repatriate the crew members as well. So at one time we had ships in 9 different ports at the same time, and not 2 ports acted, applying the same methods and procedures, even ports belonging to the same system port authority. Genoa and Savona, for example, belong to the same system port authority. The health officials in Genoa and the health officials in Savona happily disagreed on procedures to be implemented when facing, a COVID infected ship. I'll leave it here because otherwise it's going to be too boring and too frustrating to go over these experiences.
Thank you.
But to go back to your question, yes, indeed, we would certainly need some type of digital initiative like the one which are being implemented by Montreal.
Thank you. Maybe we can share good practices. I'd like to get back to Patricia for a moment. When you were speaking about the supply chains and regionalization, she had a comment she'd like to also share with us. Patricia?
Yes, thank you. Well, I just, on touching on Giulio's comment about the localization, I feel what I've noticed in the short 3-4 month period that we've been going through this whole pandemic, we have seen a shift towards localization here in Canada as well, whereby a lot of people are tending to go towards, buy local and support local merchants and supply local industries. And as this pandemic is slowly evolving, although that does seem to still be a very strong feeling among people, I think there's still that demand for quality imported Italian goods. I mean, it's speaking as a Canadian and dealing with, you know, Canadian clients, it's now become ingrained in our way of life. And so we're used to having the quality Italian goods that are coming from Italy. And so although we are seeing that shift towards the localization, I don't, and obviously, we can all see that the recession is coming. I mean, you know, there's no need in hiding that. But I do feel that imports from Italy are going to continue. And, you know, although there might be some changes in volume and types of products, but I think that that return to normal will come despite the recession and despite everything that, you know, we're going to be as a world going through in the next 6, 12, 18 months.
Thank you for the optimism, Patricia. I'd like to chime in as well, because before, you know, the crisis hit here, and you know this, Tony, because you've experienced it at the port, and I'm sure Giulio Schenone saw the effects. You know, the effects of the free trade agreement between the EU and Canada were immediately felt in Italy. You know, we saw the trade numbers go up steadily in the first 18 months. It was phenomenal. You know, with Quebec, our numbers went up, you know, 20% on the bilateral trade. So, you know, we do have the premises, like Patricia said, we've got agreements, we've got consumers that, you know, do want products, and we do have cooperations, and we do have companies that work closely together, you know, between Quebec, between Canada, and, you know, with Italy. So we, you know, hopefully we will get back, but I'm taking away, let's say, a cautious sense of optimism, if you all agree. I'm taking away that we'll have to be quicker and be more technically savvy and be audacious and implement innovations to help our clients and our companies, as they're doing at the Port of Montreal. And I'm taking away that we're looking to the future with a lot of hope and resilience, because that's the people that we are, both in Quebec, both here in Italy. And I'd like to leave you with that. If you have any last comments, farò un giro di tavolo, come si dice. I'd start with Tony here on my bottom left. It's so nice to see you, I have to say, because it's so nice to see people, you know, my friends from Montreal. It's just wonderful. Go ahead, Tony.
Nice to see you as well. You know, I mean, look, just to top up in terms of what was mentioned by the other two guests in terms of diversification, you're absolutely right. As trade, I would say, between the U.S. becomes more and more complicated, to use that term. I mean, there is a big push. There is a big push to diversify to overseas markets. And I think today versus 20 or 25 years ago, it's a lot easier to be able to trade with overseas markets. We're much more knowledgeable, there's more technology, and so on and so forth. And, you know, one of the great examples I can give you is on the Port of Montreal. If you go back 10, 15 years, basically, I would say Northern Europe and the Mediterranean represented maybe 95% of the business. Today, we're running at about 27% with Asia, and nobody would have ever have dreamed that. And we do set Latin America at about 6 or 7%. And our trade with Europe, although still our core market, still is our core market, that'll never change. But in relative terms, in terms of the makeup of the whole port numbers, I mean, only represents maybe 50 or 52% of our total exchange. So there's a lot of global diversification that's going on now, and we're seeing more and more of that. And yeah, I share some of the optimism that you are. I mean, 2021, I think will obviously can't get as bad as what it is today, but we see some early signs of some progress going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Mr. Schenone?
Well, I wish I wouldn't like to appear like the only pessimist. I certainly am not by nature, and I feel that there are at least a couple of other macro events which will, in a way, steer the way, you know, the global trade and the global economy will go. One is the effect of Brexit. I mean, we still haven't fully realized what Brexit will mean as far as Europe and as far as trading with European partners, whether it's the North American continent or Asia, because Brexit took place, then COVID came, and of course it was still hanging out there, and it's a bit of an unknown entity. And the other macro event which is coming are the U.S. American elections, which are clearly going to shape part of the economic outlook for 2021, certainly, depending on whichever way they might go. So I think we are in for a long remainder of 2020 and a challenging 2021. A couple of these macro events may actually influence which direction we take. Otherwise, as to your comment earlier, Mr. Boemi is always welcome to visit Italian ports, as he knows.
Thank you. Patricia will give you the last word.
Thank you. Well, I think, as far as international trade goes, I mean, listen, we're going to be continuously presented with varying challenges in the next 12 to 18 months, but I don't think it's anything new in terms of, I mean, that's business. Business presents challenges. Obviously, there are the political challenges, the American elections, the Brexit that Giulio has just gone through. There's the health challenges. I mean, whether or not the world goes through a second wave of this pandemic and how that will impact everything, whether it means we have to go through another worldwide lockdown or whether we find other ways of getting by. So there are definitely several challenges that will be presented to us as entrepreneurs, as anybody involved in business and trade. I think trying to remain optimistic. I think that we need to build on what we've learned from this pandemic. And one of the main lessons is the ability to be agile and to change and to just, change your whole business model in a week if you need to. But that's what we've learned from this. And we need to take that and build on it. And going forward, that's I think the only way that businesses will survive and international trade. I mean, that's what's going to keep us going.
Thank you, Patricia. Oh, my microphone, yes. Well, if this is any indication, I mean, we've adapted quickly. Look at us. We've got together. We were able to have a very interesting discussion. You're on one continent, we're in another. Thank you again, really, for doing this with us. I look forward to another conversation. It is optimism, but it is cautious, Mr. Schenone. We're not kidding ourselves. I wish you all the best. Again, thank you for your time and for your insight. And thank you for joining us. I'd like to remind everyone online, whether you're tuning in from Montreal or from Quebec City or from our beautiful regions, please do remember that you have an office here in Italy. It is the Quebec office with a team of specialized professionals eager to help you in your efforts to enter this very vital market. Merci encore. À bientôt. Bonne fin de journée. Merci et au revoir. Au revoir.
Thank you.